McCuistion. For over 25 years, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, CF Accountants and Consultants, adding value to clients throughout the region, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Banana republics in South America and Africa suffer greatly from voting fraud, but surely this isn't the problem in America, or is it? On this program, we'll examine whether we have fraud. The short answer is yes, but also whether the fraud is such that it really matters. We'll look at who commits the fraud and why. We'll also take a shot at finding some solutions, so if you don't want your vote wasted, stay with us as we meet the experts. I'd like to start with our Skype guest joining us from Houston, and he's Dan Wallach. He's Associate Professor in Computer Sciences at Rice University. He's also Associate Director of Accurate, which stands for a Center for Correct, Usable, Reliable, Auditable, and Transparent Elections, and that's a mouthful. He's testified voting security issues before governments in the United States, Mexico, and the European Union, and he's been an expert witness in voting technology issues. Dan, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Just hang in there and we'll come back to you in just a few minutes.
Great.
In the studio, on my left is Rene Martinez. He is the Regional Director for LULAC. He's a graduate of SMU, a lifelong educator, and I think now teaching at Eastfield College. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Sitting next to you is someone you've known for a long time, and so have I, coming back to our program after many years. Tom Pauken is a former chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission. He's a lawyer, a former chairman of the Texas Republican Party, and a former member of President Reagan's White House staff. Finally, he narrowly lost 2 congressional races about 30-some-odd years ago, Tom, and I suspect that you'd be one of those people who say there's no fraud at all. So is there any voter fraud or not?
I've been there. I know what it's all about.
Tell us about it.
Well, it's, you know, Texas has an illustrious history of voter fraud, or a questionable history, however way you want to distinguish it. I think back when I was a young boy, 1948, the election between Governor Coke Stevenson and Lyndon Johnson for the U.S. Senate in Duval County, 87 votes. Suddenly a couple of hundred votes were discovered at the end, and LBJ, who later went on to the presidency, won that election by voter fraud.
Well, it's only because the last 200 people voted with the same name and in order and all that. I mean, what's that all about?
And that model has been passed on here in Dallas County. I call myself a recovering attorney these days. I'm more on the business side, but I represented a lady by the name of Elsie Faye Higgins, who later was elected to the Dallas City Council, and it was a voter fraud case. And in that instance, you had election judges essentially voting people and then signing their signatures, in a sense, forgeries. And there's so many ways of voter fraud, and Dallas has had a long history of expertise on that, unfortunately. You've got absentee ballots where elderly people have their ballots made out for them. You have vans taking people around from one polling site to another. And it's and you even have a family in this town with a long tradition of being able to get out the vote no matter what it takes. So this is a real problem, and I'm glad to see it's being addressed. And I think technology can help to a certain extent, but voter ID, being able to identify who votes, is critical, because at the end of the day, the honesty and the integrity of our elections are what it's all about. And so whatever we need to do in order to make that happen, I'm very supportive of, and I think this has to be cleaned up once and for all.
Okay. Now, we're going to talk about voter ID, as you know, in a separate program, but Rene, you've heard him. Can you dispute any of the fraud things he's talking about? And do we have a fraud issue? And if so, is it a big problem?
Well, let's look at it historically. I was 2 years old in 1948 during the Duval case. So I think you have to look at it from a historical perspective. Very few blacks and Hispanics voted in 1948. I think the demographic changes in this state, in this country, have created this sense of there is fraud, there are a lot of people that are voting illegally because of the demographic changes. The demographic changes are obvious. The vast growth in demographics in the state of Texas is Hispanics. So there's a fear that this huge number of potential voters, of potential people that are going to register to vote, will be committing fraud. And so I think that's number one. That's historically, we have to look at it, where we were, where we are now. The cases that Tom mentioned, I was born and raised here in Dallas. Those were isolated cases. Those were not systemic cases in which you created those instances where people were driving people to the polls illegally, mail-ins, false addresses. Those were isolated cases, and in many cases, some of these people were convicted and were charged with offenses in terms of committing fraud. But they were isolated. They were not systemic. And so that's really the conversation that I think we need to address. Is it systemic? Are they isolated? Is it statewide? Is it millions of cases? Is it thousands of cases? Or is it just a handful of cases in few key areas and in local levels?
Yeah, because we're always going to have some people who do things wrong.
Absolutely.
I mean, that we all know that. So, Tom, he says it's not a systemic issue.
I beg to disagree, and I think Renee knows better. I mean, the late Frances Dirks used to virtually brag about how many votes she would get in her precinct, and I think at one time she had 13 people living in what was a 1 or 2 bedroom house. They all voted. I worked with a wonderful African-American woman who was a school teacher by the name of Judy Lott, and she described, quite frankly, how over and over and over again Frances and other election judges would essentially get out the vote. And they got it out, even though people didn't show up, they voted them. And this happens time and time again. In the Hispanic community, there have been battles within the Hispanic community over local elections. And I have a good friend who's now deceased who was heavily involved in the absentee ballot process. So this isn't isolated, this is systematic, and it needs to be addressed. And voter fraud is a huge problem, and it affects the minority community, I mean, as well as the majority community, because, as I said, I represented Elsie Faye Higgins, who had an election, I think, stolen from her. She later was elected to the city council, but she was on the wrong side of some of those powerful election judges.
I haven't left. I've been in Dallas all my life. What Tom is talking about, the 70s and 80s, some of those people were prosecuted. Some of those people were convicted, and they are isolated cases, whether you like to hear it or not. I've remained in Dallas. Are there errors? Are there cases where people misuse the ballot? Are there cases where people falsify addresses? Absolutely. But how many are there? And in some cases, now recently, those people have been tried, convicted, and they've gone to jail.
How about the Medrano case that was just 2 or 3 years ago?
And that is one of the examples. And it was not all the Medranos. It was a couple of them. They were tried, convicted, they went to jail, served their time, and that's it.
But this has been happening for 30 years, Renee. It goes into
30 years.
Or 40 years.
How many, Tom? How many?
Over and over again, election after
versus
election.
Thousands of people that vote in local elections, school board elections, county elections, state.
I know, it's certain precincts.
Out of thousands and a certain number of isolated cases. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. There's a thing about voter fraud and voter suppression.
There are a lot of
voter suppression, which is I think what we need to talk about.
There are a lot of elections that have been stolen or changed as a result of voter fraud. Close elections in this community.
You named Higgins.
I'll name my own. 800 votes.
Well,
Frances in her precinct.
Did it happen
1,600.
Did it happen in the Republican primary?
No, it was a general election.
Did any of that happen in the Republican primary?
No, the Republican primaries. It was. You find it in local elections. You find it in certain precincts, certain areas of the community, and certain families or folks that are involved in this process who do it time and time again, unfortunately.
And less, Tom, and less.
Yeah. But it could happen in primaries and has happened in primaries.
Absolutely.
Let me give you an example, Renee, for that as not a Texan. We won't pick all the Texan things here because some people probably think that it probably only happens in Texas. Let's pick on my favorite, which is Chicago, which is what I consider one of the most corrupt places in the country. So let's talk about when now President Obama first ran for the Senate there. Are you familiar with his first Senate race, the state Senate?
Very little.
Okay. Well, let me tell that viewer about, and I'll tell you and ask you about your thing. So there was a lady who had the state Senate race in Illinois. Her name is Alice Palmer. She was a communist. And she decided to, and she was a member of the Communist Party and attended all the meetings, that's why I say she was a communist. So she decided to give up her seat, and she took an unknown named Barack Obama to meet a couple of people, Bernardine Dohr and Bill Ayers, who were also, who were they, Tom, back in the day?
They come out of the 60s, the Weathermen, the radical, more than civil rights. These were radical folks.
Well, Dohr was, yeah.
Dorn, Bernadette Dorn.
Bernadette Dorn, right.
Well, Ayers
so
was too.
She took them, Barack Obama sort of anointed him as the person, and so Barack Obama decided to run. He had a great resume. He's a community organizer, and so I guess that made him qualified for the Senate. So he signed up for the Senate race, and then Alice and 3 others decided to sign up in the Democratic primary as well. What happened is the Chicago machine came in and invalidated 62% of all the signatures they had, and effectively between Christmas and New Year threw the other 4 people off the ballot, so Barack Obama was there by himself. You don't call that voter fraud?
Yes.
Okay, you do call it
that particular case, yes. In Chicago, yes.
In Chicago, and that happens pretty much a lot, I think, in Chicago. Yeah. Now, Chicago had something to do with John Kennedy's election too, as I recall. Isn't that about right, Tom?
Yeah, it's been a historic problem. I mean, this is a problem across
again,
the country.
The 60s, but this thing with Barack Obama
and
was
Louisiana
1994.
Also with, Governor Long.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Governor Long, who's the only guy I know who has 2 jobs, in prison and governor. Those are the only 2 jobs I can think of with Governor Long. Now, let me take you to Minnesota. John Fund, who wrote this book, if I could borrow this book, and John couldn't be here today, but it's called Who's Counting? I don't know if you've seen this book. He wrote another book called Stealing Elections. Larry Sabato, who's been on our program several times over the years, wrote a book a few years ago called Dirty Little Secrets. This book is replete with fraud and current fraud. Renee, I hate to say it, it's current fraud. And let me give you one example that John and I talked about just this week, and it's in this book. The example is that we had a guy elected in Minnesota named Al Franken. Al Franken, of course, was a comedian, which again, makes him fairly competent to be a politician, I think, yeah. And so he was elected after it went on for months as to who won the election. He won by about 390 votes. Turns out that after they decided to go ahead and make him the senator, that they found that 1,200 felons, convicted felons, had voted. And they checked on the felons, and 90% of them voted Democratic. So that election was effectively stolen in Minnesota. Now, that may not seem important, but Al Franken became the 60th senator who voted for the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. So to say that voter fraud doesn't have implications today seems a little bit disingenuous.
Well, all I'm talking about is in Texas at this point. You've gone into another arena, and that's a good conclusion. But I was under the assumption that we're going to be talking about voter fraud in the state of Texas.
Well, we are.
And what it's going to impact, how it's going to impact on the demographics of this state, and how it is impacting on the demographics, and what I call voter suppression.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go to our guy, Dan Wallach. You're at Rice, so tell us just a little bit about what you see in terms of voter fraud, and then we're going to move on and talk about some solutions in a few minutes.
All right. I'll tell you as much as I can. I don't study cases of fraud directly, so I can't speak to specific instances. I've certainly heard all the same rumors, particularly with regard to absentee postal voting, as of votes being so bought and sold. The issue for me is that the electronic voting machines that have been adopted by Texas and nationwide, particularly after the year 2000 or so, after punch cards and lever machines were considered obsolete and were pushed out the door, these new electronic voting machines were never really designed with fraud in mind. They were never designed with the idea that there would be people trying to hack them, people trying to modify them. They were never engineered to produce convincing evidence to the loser of the election that they really lost. They don't have a good way of doing recounts, and security studies that I've worked on and others have worked on have found really significant security vulnerabilities. So that is a new concern, especially when you put it in light of this history we've been discussing today, where a lot of people are awfully motivated to cast votes that they shouldn't be allowed to cast. So we have people who are motivated, we have people who are willing to defraud the system, and when we have a technology that appears to be vulnerable, it's important to take steps to mitigate those vulnerabilities.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, Renee, let me go to you. This thing about electronic voting, I mean, do you share my concern that it just doesn't have the checks and balances today?
Absolutely.
We're going to come back to Dan in a minute with the great solution.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But I'm more concerned in terms of the identification process. We live in a state right now where the state of Texas is challenging thousands of people to not be able to obtain their birth certificates, okay? For reasons that their parents were not born in this country. South Texas, now it's coming central, it's coming north. I've gotten calls of families not being able to obtain a birth certificate, being born in this country.
Right. You're,
okay?
you're not talking about non-citizens now.
No,
no.
I'm talking about U.S.
folks
citizens
who are illegal,
having
right.
to jump through hoops
Right.
because the state of Texas has decided to have this type of law. Really, it's a rule. Right. I don't know if it's a law yet. So, and that's one form of identification that I would think. The pictorial IDs, that's another issue.
Right.
Elderly people, the whole driver's license issue in terms of having, I don't have problems going to vote. I don't take my voter registration card. In fact, the judge, when I walk in, he says, "Hi, Renee, how are you?" I don't even have to show a driver's license with my picture on it. Right. Okay? So it depends on where you live, who you know, your pattern of voting, or your
you've
pattern
been here
of
forever. They
exactly,
know you. They know
exactly.
me. They know Tom.
But
they
to,
see
but
us
to
coming.
create these additional hurdles for young people, college students, the elderly, who don't have access to being able to obtain those legitimate, legal forms of ID, I think is suppressing the voters in our state.
Okay, so that's another issue on voter fraud we're going to come to. Tom.
Well, I think back to the point, I think Dan, the professor at Rice, is right on the money. And I'm glad to see that he's working on this, because I've been skeptical of this process for a long time, because you've got to be able to track back some way to the ballot. If you're questioning certain ballots, did that person really vote? Or was that person registered? Or was that person, as you say, a convicted felon and not entitled to vote? If you don't have a system of where you can track it back, and it's very hard to overturn an election, and the technology, we know what hackers have done to our own federal government. Imagine if they, how easier it is to hack into these electronic voting machines. Yeah. So I'm very concerned, and I'm glad to see that he and others are working on trying to come up with a solution.
All right, let me say, Renee, I think you'd agree that this sort of technology can, in fact, defraud
Absolutely.
the very people you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Somebody can steal their vote effectively, isn't that right?
I went to a ball game yesterday, Mavericks game. I didn't have a ticket. I had the Scantron. My son sent it to me, had it on my phone, went up to the gate, she scanned it, then printed out the tickets. Why don't we use that type of technology to do that?
Because I could have taken your phone and gotten the ticket
Absolutely.
just as well.
I'm
That's
not
a little
saying
different from
I'm
voting.
not saying the exact way.
I got it.
But
Well,
using that type of technology, biometrics, whatever the professor's recommending, that can do that.
I'm going to let the professor tell us what he's recommending, because it's really exciting. But first, let me tell you one other story on the Republican side. I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm going to tell you that there are two videos out there, one called Pay to Play, another one called Video the Vote. And I'd suggest that you watch both of them online. You can see them. And here is what the allegation is. The allegation is that the 2004 election for president in Ohio was stolen by the Bush administration over John Kerry. And I don't have time to go into the whole thing, but basically all voted on Diebold machines, which are an Ohio thing, by the way, and the president of Diebold is a big Bush supporter. They have all these machines, okay, but people pushing the button. Now, it'd be very difficult to screw up one, not difficult, but probably you wouldn't want to do each machine to do it wrong. But what they did was that once you combine all those things electronically, and Dan knows I'm outside my realm of expertise here when I'm talking about technology, you combined all of them. Apparently, the Secretary of State, a Republican in Ohio, hired a firm called Smart Tech, and so all of these computer things then had to go through and be routed out of Ohio down to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and through a computer system there, and then back to the Secretary of State in Ohio. And so it appeared that John Kerry was leading until they decided to count all the ballots, and then when they got through Chattanooga through Smart Tech, a guy who was working with Karl Rove, I might point out, turns out that John Kerry ended up winning Ohio and may have lost the election because of that kind of fraud. Would you consider that a potential problem? And that's not all that long ago.
As long as the producer of this film was not the one that did the Planned Parenthood film, okay? I'm willing to look at it.
No, this producer of this film is definitely on your side of the political spectrum,
right,
I can assure you that. Okay, now Dan, you and I talked about yesterday the exciting thing that you're working on. So give us just a couple of 3 minutes of what you're doing and how you may have a solution to the problem.
All right. So I'm working together with Dana DeBeauvoir, who's the county clerk of Travis County, that's Austin, Texas. They were one of the first adopters of electronic voting in the state of Texas. And their voting systems, like everybody else's electronic voting systems that we bought then, are getting old. When computers get old, they don't work as well. The capacitors fail, the resistors fail, things start breaking. So they know it's time to replace them. And they looked around at what was on the market and they said, there's nothing here we like. The stuff is expensive and we don't want any of it. And to make a long story short, they called me and I got to bring in all my friends. And we've been working for several years on designing a new thing from scratch. It's a very rare opportunity that somebody asks you, let's design a new voting machine from nothing. And how should we do it? So it needs to be affordable. It needs to have fancy verifiability features, so that way, even if the software is malicious or tampered, it can't cheat. There's other things you want. You want to have printed paper ballots, so that way, even if the computers fail wildly, you have printed paper backups. You want to have recount procedures that look at the paper, that look at the electronic records, and make sure that they're consistent. But you want it to be fast, because everybody wants election results on election night. So we kind of have this ridiculous set of requirements. And we've been working for about 3 years now on writing them down, agreeing on how to solve some of the trickier parts. And at this point, we have like a 100-page long design. And the next stage is getting the money together to hire somebody to actually build the design. So this is the standard political process. You have a thing that you want, you agree on the thing you want, you find somebody to build it for you. And once you've got it, then you can use it. And perhaps other counties in Texas will join in to share the cost and share the benefit of it. This is all work in progress, but we're very excited about what we've done.
Well, we appreciate that, Dan, for 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, I think most of us would agree that technology needs to be part of the solution. Right. And yet, if it's not verifiable, if we can't have the evidence, as he talks about, Renee, then we're lost, aren't we, in terms of knowing what's going on if something goes wrong?
Well, the systems are going to be as good as the people. And I think the key in terms of technology is to eliminate voter fraud to the extent, it's not going to be 100%.
Oh, no.
But to eliminate it to the point that we can say, we really now feel comfortable, and it's not keeping people out of the voting process, which in this country we've fought and died, and a lot of people have shed a lot of tears over obtaining the right to vote.
Okay. Tom, what do you think about his idea?
I think it's terrific. Yeah. I mean, it's going to address a new problem that has emerged, but you still have the old problems that have to be addressed. Mm-hmm. I mean, the human failure or the human desire to cheat. And so there are always going to be people to find ways to get around the system. But I'm glad to see what he's doing, because it's very difficult to address the issue of voter fraud with the kind of machines that we have today.
Yeah. And the human problem is nonpartisan.
That's right.
Well, I just gave you examples on both sides of the thing. There's no question about that. But as I said before, is that there's so much at stake. There's so much money being spent everywhere by governments everywhere. The propensity to want to steal is high. And then secondly, and Tom, of course, you served in some administrations, but you lost 2 elections. So I guess your power desire was thwarted. Is that basically right, or do you still have that desire for power as well?
No, I mean it happens. You just have to go on, move on with your life, and but in the future, I don't want to see other people have to go through that. And what happened to Coke Stevenson, what happened to me, what happened to many other people, we've got to do what is necessary to ensure the integrity of the ballot box.
Well, Renee, as you know, Hector Flores was going to be here, and he called and he said, look, I got to be in Columbia to look over the elections in Columbia today. And I don't know, I started doing the research for this program, and I thought, Hector, don't go to Columbia, stay here in Dallas, you know, help us as much as we can, don't you think?
Well, countries like Mexico, people are saying we ought to be looking at the electoral process in Mexico. They're doing some very interesting things in terms of IDs and biometrics and things of that nature. So there's some best practices out there. Let's not stereotype some of these Latin American countries.
Well,
they're not all banana republics.
Yeah, no, they're right. They're not all banana republics. Somebody's called America a banana republic. Okay, Tom, you have the last 15 seconds.
Well, I'm glad to see this issue being addressed. What happens is it usually only comes up when you've got a tight election and there are accusations of voter fraud. I do think it's a historic problem and it has not been resolved to this date. And anything we can do to ensure the integrity of the ballot box is critical.
Well, I appreciate both of you being here and for all the things that you've done in your lives, too. Thank you very much. You know, as we discussed on the program, voting fraud has been with us since the beginning of the Republic, and I personally doubt that we'll ever totally get rid of it, just like they do. The Voting Act may actually be one place where technology may not help us, but it might if Dan gets what he wants, and I hope he does. You know, the reason I'm skeptical about eliminating fraud is because today's government at all levels is so big and so expensive. If H.L. Mencken was right that an election is merely an advance auction on the sale of stolen goods, then we all know that there are many more stolen goods today. Check McCuistionTV.com for a program on voter ID because that's a related issue. Follow us on Twitter, and thanks again for inviting us in for the last 25 years to talk about things that matter with people who care.
A DVD of this program is available for $20 plus $5 postage and handling, and in Texas, applicable tax. For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nikkien@nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcasts on iTunes. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, CF Accountants and Consultants, adding value to clients throughout the region, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future. Thank you for joining us in our 25th year of Conversations That Matter.